All right, so we're diving into Stephen King's Blaze today.
Oh yeah, this one's a good one. It's
It's not your typical King novel, is it?
no, it's one of those I guess you could call it a trunk novel.
Oh, right, one he wrote early on and kind of tucked away.
Yeah, like he revisited it years later, polished it up, and decided to finally share it.
And King himself said he wanted it to be like this minor tragedy of the underclass. Did you know he actually used a specific typewriter font
I think I read that somewhere.
to try and create that gritty noir feel?
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah. You mentioned wanting to get a feel for the book, before diving in for a full read.
Yeah, definitely.
So that's what we're going to do. We're going to unpack the main character, the plot, and what makes this story so, well, King-esque.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
Let's start with Blaze himself, shall we? I mean, his real name's Clayton Blaisdell Jr.
Right, but everyone calls him Blaze.
Yeah, and the guy's been through a lot, abandoned by his mother, raised in a state home, facing abuse left and right. You really have to wonder how anyone comes out of that.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah, and the book makes it clear he doesn't come out unscathed. There's that part where Blaze falls down the stairs as a child, and the doctor basically predicts he'll end up like, what was it,
A human carrot, I think,
right, basically in a vegetative state.
which obviously he doesn't. But you can tell that fall has a huge impact on him.
It makes you think about that whole nature versus nurture thing, like how much of Blaze's intellectual disability stems from the fall and how much is it due to, well, the messed up environment he grew up in.
It's a really good question. How much control do we really have over our own destinies, right?
Right, and then you have the nickname Blaze itself.
Yeah, it's not exactly a name he chose.
No, he got it from a burn on his forehead after another fall. It's kind of ironic considering the kind of rage that simmers beneath the surface.
It's like King's given us a little clue right from the start. We've got this physically imposing figure, but there's a whole lot of vulnerability underneath.
Definitely. And then to make things even more complicated, we've got George, Blaze's partner in crime. But here's the twist.
George is dead, but he's still in Blaze's head.
Yeah, it's like creepy, but brilliant at the same time.
It creates this constant tension. You've got George's ghostly guidance, which isn't always so helpful.
And then Blaze trying to make sense of it all with his own, limitations.
Yeah, and, even when George was alive, their relationship was, well, toxic, to say the least.
Yeah, that's right. George was manipulative and emotionally abusive. There's that small detail. I think it's when Blaze tries to buy them coffee.
Yeah, he even offers to get George's with cream.
And George just lays into him for spending money they don't have, for thinking he deserves something nice.
Blaze can't seem to do anything right in George's eyes. So we've got this really complex character, a troubled past, and now he's trying to pull off a kidnapping scheme that he and George cooked up before George died.
And this is where the crime novel aspect really kicks in, right?
Right, the target is baby Joseph Gerard IV, heir to a wealthy family.
And the plan itself, where did that even come from?
I think it was inspired by some guy who just offhandedly suggested, like, drop it from a plane or something.
Yeah.
But what we see is Blaze really struggling to carry out the plan step by step.
Mhm.
And of course, with George's ghost whispering instructions and criticisms the whole time.
Drop it from a plane. That's terrifying. But it sounds like King's using this plan, or at least the idea of it, to explore Blaze's character in a really nuanced way.
Absolutely. You mentioned Blaze shows moments of tenderness towards the baby, right?
Yeah.
Which is interesting because he's the one who kidnapped him in the first place.
Exactly. It sets up this internal conflict. You have this horrific act on one hand, but then you see him buying baby supplies, carefully putting together a crib, even freaking out when he finds the baby covered in vomit. You start to question, well, how are we supposed to judge a character like Blaze?
Is he just blindly following orders from this ghost? Or is there something more going on inside him?
I love how King uses symbolism to add all these layers too. You mentioned the hot Ford in our prep notes and something called Hetton House.
Yeah, King's a master at that. He's always weaving in symbolism to deepen the story. The hot Ford. Think of it as freedom and escape for Blaze, but also kind of a reminder of the dangerous road he's on.
Oh, I see.
And then there's Hetton House. That's the state home where Blaze grew up. A place of hardship, but also his only source of positive memories.
What kind of memories?
Like a friendship he had with another boy there, John. Even moments of beauty, reciting poetry in class.
So Hetton House represents this kind of push and pull between his dark past and those glimmers of, well, something better.
Right, and it makes his internal struggle with George even more heartbreaking.
Yeah.
As the kidnapping goes on, their partnership starts to unravel, even though George is, a goat.
That's right. It's like their ghostly partnership starts to fracture too.
Exactly. George gets more and more aggressive, pushing Blaze to get rid of the baby. Remember, George just cares about the payoff. But Blaze, it's like he's starting to feel, I don't know, maybe some paternal instincts.
Interesting. So you have this loyalty to his dead friend clashing with this, what, unexpected protectiveness toward the baby.
It's fascinating to see how that plays out. Blaze is in this impossible situation.
And then it all leads up to that climax where Blaze finally breaks free of George's control, right?
Things get really intense. Blaze refuses to kill the baby. He makes a choice that goes against everything George ever taught him. It's this turning point where you see Blaze is capable of, I don't know, defying his past and making his own choices, even if it costs him everything.
Wow, it sounds like Blaze's story is full of crime, moral ambiguity, and these unexpected moments of humanity. But I'm still stuck on that question we talked about earlier. Is Blaze ultimately a villain or a victim?
That is the question, isn't it? And I don't think it's one with an easy answer.
How can you even begin to judge a character with such limitations? It's not black and white.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes Blaze so compelling.
Yeah, I'm definitely adding this one to my reading list. It sounds like an amazing character study.
Yeah, it is. King doesn't shy away from those tough questions. He makes you think about free will, the impact of our pasts, where that line between right and wrong gets blurry.
We've covered a lot of ground already. I feel like I'm starting to understand Blaze a lot better. But before we wrap up this part, there was this one detail from the ending you mentioned that I'm really curious about.
Oh, you mean the epilogue?
Yeah.
That last scene with Baby Joe in the hospital.
Yeah, it really stuck with me. What's the significance of that moment?
Well, I think King's circling back to those themes of perception and memory. Baby Joe is recovering from the trauma, but he's starting to forget the details. And then he sees a face bending over him, the wrong face, not his parents, and he starts to cry.
It's heartbreaking, even if he can't fully grasp what happened. It speaks to the lasting effects of trauma, especially for a baby.
And then there's that final image, right?
Yeah.
The person trying to comfort Joe blows on some toy birds hanging above his crib, making them fly. The baby stops crying, totally captivated by this. His fear is replaced by, well, wonder.
That's a powerful image. It makes me think about Blaze's whole life, this constant struggle for connection, for those fleeting moments of beauty and escape. He might have been flawed, maybe even dangerous, but he offered Joe those glimpses of kindness amidst all the chaos.
It's a really beautiful way to end the story. King leaves us thinking about the impact we have on others, even when our actions aren't perfect. Even the most troubled souls can leave behind a legacy of kindness, however small.
Wow, you're right. It's not a traditional happy ending, but it definitely makes you think. It makes you wonder how much of our past defines us and how much we can choose to act with compassion, even when we've been dealt a bad hand.
Exactly. And that's King's brilliance. He doesn't give you easy answers. He forces you to confront the messy realities of the human experience, the good, the bad, all of it.
This deep dive has been great. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of Blaze.
I'm glad to hear that. And we've talked a lot about Blaze, but there's one person we haven't really focused on yet. The man who arguably had the biggest impact on his life.
George.
Yeah, George Rackley. Or Rasp, as he's known on the streets.
We've talked about his manipulation throughout the whole story, but in the source material, King goes deeper into his backstory. We see his own troubled past and what turned him into the hardened criminal who ultimately led Blaze down such a dark path. I'm definitely curious to hear more about that, but I guess we'll have to save it for the next part of our deep dive into Blaze.
You got it. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be back with more on George's story and how it shaped Blaze's life. So we ended last time talking about whether Blaze is a villain or a victim. And it's a question that really gets to the heart of this book, doesn't it?
It does. Like, yeah, he kidnaps a baby. That's pretty villainous.
Right?
But then you consider his past, the abuse, how George manipulated him.
And his limitations.
Exactly. It makes you rethink that whole villain label.
It's not so black and white.
It's not. King really doesn't give us easy answers, does he?
Nope, he doesn't. And when you look at why Blaze actually goes through the kidnapping, it's not out of greed or anything like that.
Yeah.
He genuinely believes he's doing what's best for their partnership.
Even though George is already dead.
Yeah, even though George is dead.
There's that line where Blaze tries to justify the kidnapping. Something like, the Gerard family stole the money themselves, only like Woody Guthrie says, with a fountain pen instead of a gun.
It's twisted logic for sure.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
But it shows just how much George's way of thinking has warped Blaze's own sense of right and wrong.
Right. It goes back to that nature versus nurture. idea again.
Yeah,
How much of who we are is set in stone and how much is shaped by our experiences.
exactly. You think about Blaze's upbringing in Hetton House, where physical punishment was the norm, then add in George's influence, pushing him towards a life of crime.
It's like he never had a chance.
Right. It makes you wonder if the system even recognizes those nuances.
Yeah.
In the book, they just label Blaze's file retarded. Like, that's all he is, a label, not a person.
It's dehumanizing. But then there are times when those societal assumptions about disability actually work in Blaze's favor.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Remember that scene with the state trooper?
The one who believes John Schelsman's lie about Blaze being deaf and dumb.
Yes. And the trooper even gives John advice about buddies sticking together.
Totally clueless about what's really going on.
It's almost funny, in a dark kind of way.
Yeah, it's like a perfect example of how Blaze navigates the world
Constantly underestimated, misunderstood.
and taken advantage of. But it raises this question, right? How society views people with intellectual disabilities. Do those low expectations become self-fulfilling prophecies?
It's complicated, and what's interesting is that even with those limitations, Blaze still manages to pull off the kidnapping. He evades the police. He even forms genuine connections with people. Like with Anne Bradstay, that summer they spent blueberry picking.
Oh, yeah?
It starts as this transactional thing, orchestrated by the other boys.
She agrees to sleep with him for money.
But then it turns into something more.
A real connection, even if it's brief.
It shows that even someone like Blaze, who's been labeled an outcast, he's still capable of experiencing love. Yeah. It makes you wonder what his life could have been like if things had been different.
Yeah, if he'd had the right support, the right opportunities. Even though Anne betrays him in the end, those memories stay with him.
They do. And there are other glimpses of his humanity throughout the book.
Yeah, like his love for poetry.
Oh, yeah. The part where he recites, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood" in class.
Such a powerful image.
It is. This big, seemingly unintelligent guy finding solace in the beauty of language.
It really challenges our assumptions about him.
Yeah.
Makes his final act, protecting the baby, even though George wants him to kill him, even more significant.
That defiance is incredible.
It is.
Blaze chooses compassion, even if it means sacrificing everything.
He does. So coming back to our original question, is Blaze a villain or a victim?
It's both.
Yeah, it's not a simple either. It's that complexity, that moral ambiguity that makes this book so powerful.
You're right. It forces us to look beyond labels, beyond easy answers. We see the devastating effects of abuse, neglect, how society judges people.
We see Blaze struggling with his limitations, both internal and external. And maybe most importantly, we see that even in the darkest situations, there's still a capacity for love, for connection.
There's hope, even in the tragedy. I gotta say, I'm more and more convinced I need to read this book.
You should. King asks those hard questions
Mhm.
about free will, about the weight of the past, about what it even means to be good or bad.
This has been great, really insightful. I feel like I'm starting to get Blaze. But before we move on, I'm remembering another detail from the outlines, something about the ending.
Oh, you mean the epilogue with Baby Joe?
Yeah, it really stayed with me. What's the significance of that moment with the baby in the hospital?
Well, I think King's bringing back those themes of perception and memory. The baby's recovering from the trauma, but he's starting to forget what happened. And then he sees a face, but it's the wrong face. It's not his parents. And he starts crying.
Oh man, that's rough. Even though he doesn't fully understand, you can tell the trauma's still there.
It is. And then remember the last image. The person with the baby tries to comfort him by blowing on some toy birds. The birds move, and the baby stops crying. He's totally captivated.
It's a powerful image.
It is, right? It
Yeah.
makes you think about Blaze's whole life, that constant search for connection, for beauty, for escape. He messed up, for sure, but he offered the baby those moments of kindness, of comfort.
It's a beautiful way to end the story. It leaves you thinking about how we impact others even when we're not perfect.
Exactly. Even the most troubled people can leave behind a little bit of kindness.
Wow. It's not a happy ending exactly, but it's definitely thought-provoking. It makes you wonder, how much does our past really define us? How much can we choose to be compassionate?
You got it. And that's what King does so well. He doesn't give you easy answers. He makes you face the complexities of being human. The good, the bad, all of it.
I'm definitely adding this to my reading list. You've given me so much to think about, but we still have one more person to talk about, right? The person who had the biggest influence on Blaze's life.
We do. George Rackley, or Rasp, as he's known on the streets.
We've touched on his manipulative side, but the book goes deeper into his story. We see his own troubled past, what made him become the hardened criminal who led Blaze down such a destructive path. I'm really interested to hear more about that, but I guess we'll have to save it for the next part of our deep dive into Blaze.
We will. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back.
So we've spent a lot of time getting to know Blaze, his motivations, his limitations, all of that. But now I think it's time we really dig into George Rackley, or Rasp, as they call him.
Yeah, it's like, how did George become George? You know,
Right, like what made him the way he is?
you look at his childhood,
Yeah.
and it's no picnic.
Mm.
Broken home. A mom who had a string of abusive boyfriends.
Yikes.
Talk about a recipe for disaster, right? Growing up with violence and neglect instead of stability and love.
Makes you think about the Gerard family, whose baby Blaze kidnaps. It's like two totally different worlds.
It is. It is. That's one of the things King does so well in this book, right? It's not just a crime story. It's a commentary on society. That gap between the rich and the poor.
And the cycle of abuse, too.
Yeah, exactly. George grows up experiencing violence firsthand. And what does he do? He ends up perpetuating that cycle.
With his sister, Tansy,
Right, with Tansy.
and with Blaze, who he basically uses for his own schemes.
You remember that scene when George is a kid and he sees his mother's pimp beating him?
Oh, Pisser Kelly. Yeah, that was disturbing.
His sister's begging Kelly to stop, but he just tells her to shut up.
Shut your fucking air scoop, I think it was.
Yeah, that's the one. It's a brutal scene, but it shows how violence becomes normal for George.
Like just another part of life.
It explains why he ends up choosing a life of crime. He's looking for ways to, I don't know, take advantage of other people's weaknesses.
It makes you wonder if he ever had a chance.
Right, like what if things had been different?
But the book portrays George as smart, right? Like the brains of the operation.
Oh yeah, he's cunning, street smart, manipulative. But there's also this sense that he's held back by his own cynicism.
Like he can't see the good in anything.
Yeah, like he doesn't trust anyone. Everyone's a pawn to him, you know.
Yeah.
Even Blaze.
Who he claims is his friend.
Exactly. It's sad because Blaze really craves George's approval.
Even though George is incapable of real affection.
There's that scene when George is in prison and he tells Blaze to stay away from their old hangout, Moochie's, and to get a straight job.
Oh, yeah. Almost sounds like he cares.
Right. Almost.
Yeah.
But then he throws in that dig about Blaze being too dumb. Classic George.
Backhanded compliment.
Yeah, exactly. It's subtle manipulation. Pushing Blaze away, but also keeping him tethered.
It's messed up.
It is. And you know what's crazy? It doesn't stop when George dies. Blaze is still looking to him for guidance, even though it's just a voice in his head.
Yeah, it shows how strong that hold can be. It's like a ghost of a toxic relationship.
Exactly. George isn't just a ghost. He represents the trauma that keeps shaping Blaze's choices.
Even after he's gone.
It's ultimately George who puts the whole kidnapping plan into motion.
And when things start to unravel, who's the one telling Blaze to kill the baby?
George. The ghost of George.
It's like even in death, the people who hurt us can still have a powerful influence over us. A destructive influence.
Which makes Blaze's decision not to kill the baby even more powerful.
He chooses compassion instead of listening to George.
He does. It's a moment of redemption, but a tragic one.
Yeah, Blaze's story doesn't have a happy ending, but it's a powerful story nonetheless.
It is. It's like King's saying, look, we can be shaped by our past, by the bad things that happened to us, but we still have the power to choose a different path.
To break free from those patterns.
Yeah. To act with compassion, even when it's hard.
Wow. This deep dive has been eye-opening. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for Blaze. It's a story that makes you think about big questions, you know?
It does. It does. Good and evil, human nature, the impact we have on each other. It's classic King, really. He gets you thinking.
He does. And that's what makes a story truly great, right? It's not just about entertainment. It's about making us think, making us feel, making us question the world around us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure diving deep into Blaze with you. And for all you listeners out there, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for those stories that make you think.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Stephen King's Blaze.